Hi, I'm Micah Halpern. Thank you for joining me today as I do some thinking out loud. Our first segment is called Background Briefing. The first thing I've been thinking about is how Iran is playing the United States and how the United States is letting it happen. Teams from the United States and other Western countries are sitting in Vienna alongside Iran. Ostensibly, these bright and dedicated minds are there negotiating on how to resurrect some version, anything of the infamous nuke deal of 2015. In essence, they are involved in the diplomatic version of twiddling their thumbs. Now, it simply makes no sense. They sit around, they talk about sitting around, they plan more talks, and while they do all that diplomatic stuff, Iranian leadership is busy doing its own stuff, its own thing. Their very nefarious stuff. The Western world sits politely in a room with Iranian diplomats while Iran is plotting and activating assassins in the United States and dictating missions. Those missions are to perpetrate murders. And on their list, among others, is Salman Rushdie, John Bolton, Mike Pompeo. The incongruity is baffling. The irony is fearsome. Diplomacy and foreign relations work on many levels. I know that. I know that when dealing with international affairs, the seesaw is never stable. Sometimes you're up and sometimes you're down. It just happens. And often one hand does not know what the other is doing. That happens all the time also. But to proceed with high-level nuke talks, while Iran is actively attempting to murder former U.S. leaders, to kill citizens with international reputations, is simply sending the wrong message to Iran, and by extension, to all the enemies of the West and all the enemies of the United States. The attack on Salman Rushdie, author, thinker, public figure, was perpetrated by Hadi Matar, a 24-year-old resident of Fairview, New Jersey. Think about that. There is no doubt in my mind that Matar was acting as a result of the fatwa, the Islamic religious edict, the death sentence that was pronounced in 1989 by the Ayatollah Khamenei, the founder of the Islamic Republic of Iran. The fatwa was pronounced shortly after Rushdie published his wildly popular book, Satanic Verses. Rushdie's crime was writing a brilliant book with a brilliant title about what he determined to be the foibles of Islam. No matter what Matar thinks or says, remember, Matar was born 10 years after the fatwa. That fatwa is alive and well and still very valid in the minds of the followers of the Ayatollah. And so, on Friday morning, Salman Rushdie, the Indian-born novelist who spent years in hiding after Iran urged Muslims to kill him because of his writing, was stabbed in the face, the neck, the torso, the leg, during a lecture he was delivering in New York State. He was airlifted to a hospital, was placed on a ventilator, and was said to be then serious, and thankfully now in stable condition. We do not know much about the assassin. The name on his driver's license was not his own. It was an alias. It was contrived. The name was Hassan Mughniya. For those in the know, it was obvious. He borrowed the name Hassan from the leader of Hezbollah, Sheikh Hassan Nasrallah. Had Nasrallah been asked, he would have, I'm sure, given him not only permission but blessing to use his name. Mughniya is the last name of Imad Mughniya, the man who was the leader of the military operations and strategy for Hezbollah. The original Mughniya was killed in a joint CIA-Mossad operation conducted in Damascus in 2008. Mughniya was walking from a party at the Iranian ambassador's home. As he walked by a Mitsubishi Pajero, which looks like a Jeep, a bomb was remotely activated, killing him and destroying the car. The attack was so precise that there was almost no other damage. The spare tire of the Mitsubishi had been replaced with explosives. Iran sponsors Hezbollah, and Iran has sworn revenge for the death of Mughniya and for the deaths of other targets eliminated by the United States. High on that list is the 2020 hit on Qasem Soleimani. head of Iran's Al-Quds force. The Al-Quds force is responsible for attacks outside Iran. The attack on Rushdie came just days after Shahram Poursafi, also known as Mehdi Rezavi, was arrested and indicted for attempting to pay a hit team $300,000 to assassinate John Bolton, the national security advisor of former President Donald Trump. The United States needs to take action. The United States must teach Iran a serious lesson. Enough twiddling the thumbs and permitting Iran to act with impunity. Iran is commissioning assassins and attacks on U.S. citizens, and there must be a price to pay, on U.S. soil no less. The fact that Iran has not successfully completed all these plans is not relevant. Thankfully, Salman Rushdie will survive the plot against Bolton, and earlier plots against Pompeo were foiled. As far as Iran is concerned, they have not been punished at all for these egregious acts on U.S. soil. In fact, it appears that they have been rewarded. The talks go on in Vienna as if nothing happened, as if nothing is happening. No punishment, not even a token slap on the wrist. Yes, there were U.S. Justice Department and State Department announcements, but nothing that made any much of a ripple and an impression in the news cycle of the day. The first step is for the United States to cut off negotiations immediately with Iran. Iran needs to know U.S. positions are strict. The U.S. needs to hold these acts over Iran's heads and put Iran back in its place for being so aggressive. And the United States must strike at sensitive Iranian targets, some sensitive target, and they have to strike where the iron's hot. The analysts who claim that Iran is unpredictable and warn of dangers of Iranian responses are being myopic. Iran follows a plan. Iranian responses to various scenarios are predictable. One just has to analyze them. The longer the time that elapses between an event and the response it evokes, the less effective the message is. Every parent and every educator knows that. Our diplomats should know that too. Coming up next, Points of View. First up is a column from the Jerusalem Post. It's entitled, "The Arab View is Changing Regarding Gaza and the Middle East." Subtitled, "Opinion: There is a growing renunciation among Arab youth of Hamas and the Islamic Jihad and their actions against Israel." It was written by Hadil Weiss, and it was published on August 13th, 2022. The title tells us everything. The Arab world is changing its point of view regarding Palestinians and Israelis. This is how she begins. It's not unfamiliar to see many Arabs blaming Israel for the recent escalation between the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, PIJ, and the IDF. But what's unprecedented and worth noting is the growing renunciation among the Arab youth for the Islamic Jihad and Hamas's behavior in Gaza and against Israel. After the Abraham Accords agreements and other steps taken by Arab countries, like the recent formal opening of Saudi skies to Israel, more young Arabs are condemning the Islamic Jihad and Hamas usage of Gaza to start a new war with Israel. Despite the traditional Arab government statements that condemn the Israeli strikes on Gaza, a significant Arab popular discontent with PIJ was seen, especially with the IDF reports that the PIJ misfired rockets may have killed over a dozen in Gaza's latest battle. Now she explains that this change in attitude has been slowly and gradually happening. Now, though, it is much, much more pervasive, and this is how she writes. Even before the recent reports about PIJ missed rockets, the Arab public was generally aware that the civilians in Gaza are victims of Hamas and PIJ behavior that puts the Islamist ideology and political interest above the civilians. Moreover, these behaviors deepen the Palestinian divisions and complicate any possible political solution that may improve the lives of the people in Gaza. Her best evidence is the coverage of the most recent conflict between Israel and Gaza, that the Lebanese and the Syrian media outlets chose to cover local events over the conflict between the Palestinians in Gaza and Israel. She writes, During the latest clashes between Gaza and Israel, two different events were trending in Syria and Lebanon. The second anniversary of the Beirut port explosion and the Assad regime's attacks on the rebel-held city of Tafas in Dara, southern Syria. Many Syrians and Lebanese chose to focus on their issues rather than to participate in the propaganda campaigns waged by the PIJ, which Hezbollah and other Iranian affiliates champion. Now comes the conclusion, and here she actually identifies, I think, the important element of the trend. The Abraham Accords were an excellent opportunity to break the political taboos once considered unbreakable in the Arab world. Still, it was not alone the reason for the new trend of opposing the Islamist groups in Gaza. The poverty, infrastructure collapse, and lack of job opportunities and quality education in the countries close to the Iranian axis are forcing the next generation to question the legitimacy of the absurd wars orchestrated by the Islamist groups linked to Iran. The rejection of this model is not limited today to criticizing the PIJ or Hamas aggression. It's demonstrated in active ways when thousands of Lebanese and Iraqis protest the influence of Iranian-backed militias. But achieving any tangible wins against Iran's destructive influence in the region is beyond the capability of the Arab youth and requires a U.S. coherent plan and active engagement in the region, which doesn't exist so far. This piece is very insightful. It gives excellent perspective on Israel and Gaza through the lens of the Arab world, and that's something that's missing in most analysis. Next up is a column by Bassem Eid, a human rights activist. He began his career identifying Israeli abuses of Palestinians, but that has changed. Eid now focuses his attention on Palestinian abuses of Palestinians. He's chosen a very risky and extremely dangerous task for himself. This piece was published in Ynet on August 10, 2022. It's entitled, Iran's Manipulation of the Palestinian People. Subtitled, Unlike Hamas, PIJ is purely military organization with little regard for the growing desire of the Palestinian in Gaza to move past endless conflict. This is how Bassem Eid begins. Last week, Israel fought a short, sharp conflict with Palestinian Islamic Jihad termed Operation Breaking Dawn. The battle began when Israel received intelligence information regarding PIJ's intent to fire anti-tank missiles at Israeli targets near the Gaza border and responded with precision strikes targeting PIJ's senior leadership in Gaza. PIJ fired a barrage of more than 1,000 rockets at Israel during the 55 hours of fighting. PIJ's aggression was armed, funded, and controlled by Iran, which considers its revolutionary goals to be served by fighting Israel to the last drop of Palestinian blood. Much violence and sorrow were averted because other Palestinian factions, even the terrorist group Hamas, showed themselves too savvy on this occasion to be drawn into Iran's maelstrom. However, Iran's cynical manipulation of the Palestinian people continues and must be understood in order to be countered. Eid continues and points out that the PIJ is in lockstep with Iran. They modeled themselves on Iran and receive over $70 million a year from Iran. He writes, the PIJ's headquarters and senior leadership have resided in Tehran since 2012, when they relocated from Damascus due to the Syrian civil war. The PIJ maintained its lockstep support for Iran during the worst of the Syrian struggle, when the Yarmouk refugee camp outside Damascus, once home to the largest concentration of Palestinians in the world, was placed under a brutal siege by Syria, Iran, and Hezbollah, which strained relations between the Iranian bloc and Hamas. Ultimately, more than 4,000 Palestinians have been killed by the Iranian-backed Syrian government during the conflict, and over 500 have been tortured to death. Nevertheless, as the Jerusalem Post's Herb Kanan has explained, Iran supports Hamas, but it controls Islamic Jihad. There's a difference. He concludes, Bassem Eid is very insightful here and concludes in this way. Iran's nightmare is the possibility of peace between Israel and its Arab neighbors. including the Palestinian people. This is because Iran remains a revolutionary state, threatened by stability, and it maintains the goal of exacerbating conflict throughout the region. Under the framework of the Abraham Accords, Israel has normalized relations with several Arab neighbors. Most recently, Saudi Arabia last month took the momentous step of permitting Israeli commercial flights over its airspace. Most importantly, the people of Gaza are ready to move past endless conflict. A recent survey found that 52% of young people in Gaza, compared to only a quarter in the West Bank, agree with the statement that the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is mostly just for politicians or old people, and I simply don't think about it very much. Only Iran, the outside mischief maker, seeks to uproot the shoots of peace. The rest of the world, and particularly the Palestinians, must not be duped by this malign influence, and instead follow their interests and ensure a better tomorrow for their children and grandchildren living in peace and security alongside the Jewish homeland, the State of Israel. Bassam Eid is very insightful here, and it's important for us to understand this. This is coming from local understanding, not some external idea. So it's very worthwhile thinking about. Coming up, commentary through cartoons, where pictures tell the story. I want to show you 8 cartoons today, and memes. First is a very important concept that I want to deal with, and this is actually very serious. It's an important cartoon, but it's also very serious. It goes to the very heart of many of our conflicts and our inability to understand others. We just don't want to understand them. I find it very upsetting that discussions are now conflicts. We need to understand and respect and appreciate even ideas that are different than our own. We even have to sometimes we should learn to like ideas that are different. In this case, 2 people are standing on either side of a 6, or is it a 9? One says to the other, just because you are right does not mean that I am wrong. You just have not seen life from my side. How correct. This is a spectacular cartoon. Next up is a cartoon about prices going up. The Clydesdales are pulling a beer wagon with armored guards on top. One horse says to the other, looks like the price is going up again. Yes, there's a massive shortage of CO2, carbon dioxide of all things. Many microbreweries have already shut down. It's not only CO2. They have other supply chain issues also. The price of beer is going to go through the roof. Next up is a Russian passport with a 2-headed eagle. One eagle head is saying, I want war. The other one, I want to travel. The problem is that Russia cannot have both. Next up is a spectacular jab at the non-release of a movie, Batgirl, because preview audience found it just to be awful. We are looking at the scene from the unbelievable classic movie, The Producers, with Zero Mostel telling Gene Wilder, but just think of how much we could make by not releasing Batgirl. If you don't remember the plot of Producers, the premise was to make money on the play, which would be a bomb. The great chef Gordon Ramsay is subject of the next meme. He's looking at a pizza with bananas on top, and the caption reads, I'm calling the police. There are certain things that simply cannot be tolerated, some things that are simply out of bounds, like pizza and bananas. This next meme is a tweet of Major Donna. She's the commander of the Iron Dome 947 unit, 947. It successfully shot down every single rocket that came toward Ashkelon in the last flare-up with Gaza. It's signed, with love, Israel, I love you. Next up is a very funny play on another movie. The movie is The Titanic. The tweet reads, the Titanic replica could set sail by 2022, following the original route. Should survive this time, considering we've melted all the icebergs. And now finally, the last meme illustrates the pride parents have for their children. The caption reads, always be proud of your children. The sign on the pickup reads, my son was inmate of the month at Wabash County Jail. That's hilarious. In a moment, more of my own perspective and a few predictions. Israel announced that Gaza's Palestinian Islamic Jihad was involved in a failed attempt to launch a drone towards Tamar gas rig during the recent Operation Breaking Dawn. The terrorist group's unsuccessful launch of an unmanned aircraft from Gaza prompted Israel's army to step up its efforts to protect the gas rig's platform, which is situated in southern Israel, in the Mediterranean, in the southern part of Israel. The drone was launched from Gaza and set out across the Mediterranean Sea towards the rig before it was intercepted. It is very unusual for Israel to publicly discuss these matters. We can surmise from Israel's making of this information public that Jerusalem wants to inform the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran that drone offensives is not going to work and that Israel has upgraded its anti-drone defenses. Israel's enemies will hopefully get the message. A former Twitter manager was convicted of spying for Saudi Arabia. He was found guilty of 6 criminal counts, including acting as an agent for a foreign country and trying to disguise a payment from an official tied to the Saudi royal family. It was a $40,000 watch. The spy was found guilty after a 2.5-week-long trial held in federal court in San Francisco. Of the 11 counts in the charge against him, 5 were not proven. The other 6 he was found guilty of. Ahmed Abu Mamo is a dual U.S. Lebanese citizen. In his position at Twitter, he helped oversee relationships with journalists and celebrities in the Middle East and North Africa. There are many spies roaming around and throughout the United States. It would be a mistake to think otherwise. Most are from China, many are from Russia, and like Abu Mamo, from Arab countries also. Maybe there's a silver lining to the horrendous travel stories about lost luggage and delayed luggage. The search for missing luggage has been helpful in the fight against drug trafficking. The global backlog in airline baggage loading was instrumental in the discovery by Israeli police of a drug haul. The drugs were hidden in a suitcase that was x-rayed after it arrived a day late and went unclaimed. The tinfoil wrapped 7 kilo or 15 pounds of amphetamines, worth some $600,000, were in the false bottom of the bag, which police allowed to be sent from Ben Gurion to the Jerusalem address its owners had listed in the lost and found complaint. The drugs, of course, were no longer in the suitcase. It's not very smart to put your address on the luggage that's being used for drug smuggling. Kyiv is naming a street after Israel's first and so far only female prime minister, Golda Meir. Israeli ambassador to Ukraine, Michael Brodsky, announced the decision after meeting with Vitaly Klitschko, the mayor of Ukraine's capital city. Golda Meir, Israel's 4th prime minister, was born in Kiev in 1898. Her maiden name was Mabovich, Golda Mabovich. Golda's family fled to the United States in 1905 when she was 7 years old, escaping the anti-Semitic violence and pogroms of Ukraine, especially the Kishinev pogrom. The family settled in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Ukraine today is trying to de-Russify street names in the wake of the Russian invasion of the country. Naming a street after Golda Meir fits in with that plan. The Ukrainians have a special place in their hearts for Golda, as she is often called. Throughout this war, famous lines from her speeches have appeared in pro-Ukrainian memes, and some were even picked up by Ukrainian diplomats and politicians. People from around the world are buying their tickets for the World Cup. To prevent counterfeit tickets, the tickets can only be purchased through a single company which is located in Qatar, host of the World Cup. The company is called Winterkill Hospitality. Along with game tickets, Winterkill is offering packages for travel, hotel, food, and entertainment. You buy tickets by going on Winterkill's site, signing in, giving your region, and then your country. And that's where the complication sets in. Israel is not on the list. Occupied Palestinian territories is on the list. And Israelis are told to sign up and purchase their tickets by clicking on Occupied Palestinian Territories. FIFA awarded Qatar the honor of hosting the World Cup on the condition that all members will be welcome. Well, apparently not. The government of Qatar and Israel signed an agreement in June permitting Israelis to enter Qatar and watch the games. And Israel and Qatar are working on direct flights between the countries to allow for easier access for people who want to watch the World Cup. Israel's Prime Minister Yair Lapid and Defense Minister Benny Gantz even made public statements acclaiming the great success that the love of sport is bringing to the region. And this is now happening. We've been thinking out loud about a lot today. Now that you know what I've been thinking, let me know what you're thinking. Email me at micah@jbstv.org. Tweet me at Micah Halpern. Tell me what you think. Before we end, let me leave you with one piquante piece of information. I mentioned the Titanic earlier. It might be of interest to know that there were hundreds of Jews on the Titanic, the luxury ship that sank in 1912 after hitting an iceberg. Most Jews on the ship were in third class, down below. They had little chance of surviving and getting to the lifeboats. There were only enough boats for 50% of the passengers. Of the passengers and crew who died, well over 400 were Jewish. There were also some very important and very wealthy Jews on the ship. The famous copper baron, Benjamin Guggenheim, was worth $95 million at the time. Isidor Straus owned Macy's and was worth $50 million. This is personal wealth. The great cantor Yossele Rosenblatt recorded and sold a Kel Malay honoring Jewish dead of the Titanic. Proceeds from the record sales went to the families of the victims and raised $150,000 in 1912. Along with the Kel Malay, Rosenblatt sang a song written for the victims of the Titanic entitled Der Nasser Kever, the watery grave. The song ends with these words: "Standing there are the thousands that death will dash them forever. They cry out." It was in Yiddish. The Titanic had a kosher cook on board, a kosher kitchen facility. There were plates labeled milk and meat in Yiddish and in English. So many people on the ship wanted kosher food. Unbelievable. Thank you for thinking out loud with me, Micah Halpern. Let's think out loud again next week on JBS.